When I used to hear people talking about telling stories in their classrooms, I was a bit nervous. I've never told what I think are good stories. In fact, if I can remember back to a time when I was in the corporate world and I used to attend networking events, I would get into a group of people and think I had something fun to share. And all that would happen is that I would attempt to tell my story, and halfway through, someone else with a better story would pipe in over the top of me, and that'd be the end of it. So I was very nervous when it came to understanding how to deliver stories in a way that actually encouraged learners to become engaged and, more importantly, take away learning points from something I'd experienced. So when it came to this particular pen principle, I reflected on the many things that I have learned over my 15 to 20 year career in teaching. Not only was I nervous, but I didn't know how to make a start. So luckily I found some tips here that I can share with you that, number one, make it really easy to start storytelling, and number two, help to keep you on track when you do try to tell a story within a classroom setting so that you don't veer off and, again, more importantly, get the key points across. So without any further ado, let's have a look at what the PEN principle says, and then we'll go into those tips and techniques for how to create a compelling story and the structure around, or the process, if you like, of telling a good story that has key learning outcomes for your students. Let's have a look. Good stories do more than create a sense of connection. They build familiarity and trust and allow the listener to enter the story where they are, making them more open to learning. Good stories can contain multiple meanings, so they're surprisingly economical in conveying complex ideas in understandable ways. And stories are more engaging than a dry recitation of data points or a discussion of abstract ideas. PEN Principle 11 is to find the story behind the facts. Psychologically, when presented with a story to contextualize the facts, people can recall approximately 60% more facts and better overall comprehension. Educationally, the use of stories leads to improved engagement, enjoyment, and a broader understanding of the concepts. And neurologically speaking, presenting facts into a unified story activates more neural regions of the brain, including sensation, emotion, memory, and mentalization. The questions we want to answer here are: how can you prepare a compelling story? And what are the components of an engaging story that still maintain the factual information? A good introduction to storytelling is understanding the benefits across multiple learning preferences. In a 2017 Harvard Business article, Paul Smith is quoted as stating that visual learners appreciate the mental pictures that storytelling evokes. Auditory learners focus on the words and the storyteller's voice. Kinesthetic learners remember the emotional connections and feelings from the story. So how do we make a start? An easy way I've found to make a start is to start with a picture. If you've never tried to tell a story in your classroom, use a picture to start you off. For example, a picture of a stressed out teacher can be used to start a story about a very human moment that you may have experienced as a trainer where things went wrong and the key learning points that it taught to you. Think about the key topics that you teach. What anecdotes, narratives, or reflections helped you learn something elementary or important in your career? Perhaps jot down a few of these ideas now so that you can come back to them later. How can you make your story compelling? What are the absolutely key things that you will need to do to ensure that storytelling meets the outcomes that you want? Well, to start with, every story must have a beginning, middle, and end, and each of these parts does something different. The beginning introduces the listener to the scene. Just like an opening scene of a movie, you get the feel for the environment in which the story will unfold. For example, a serene beach scene might invoke a calm, nature-based story. An interior of a workshop might create a sense of accomplishment or focus, and so on. But you're probably thinking that, I've seen plenty of movies that start on the beach and end up in a shootout. Well, yes, you're skipping ahead here because the storytelling itself is told in the middle section, and you are free to take your listeners on an emotional journey throughout this time. In a learning context, the introduction can be as little as one sentence. For example, 10 years ago, I sat exactly where you're sitting, eyes wide, head filled with questions, and a large amount of faith and hope in my chest. Okay, so that was a little dramatic, but you get the idea. So now you've made a start. You have an idea, picture, a few sentences to get things started. It's time now to move on to the middle part. the part where the lessons are illustrated clearly and the story unfolds nicely. What I tend to do is write down the key words that I can identify as key learning points. These sit in the margin of a piece of paper or a Word document so I can review them if needed, and they help me keep my story on the right path so I don't waffle or miss out on the intended outcome. There is no right or wrong length to a good story, only a bad story. If you've ever listened to someone recounting a night out and it doesn't seem like they ever get to the point, well, you see where I'm going with this. A bad story is both too short and too long all at the same time. It's too short if the point would have required a few extra words, and it's too long if too many words were used to get us there. You lose interest, you get frustrated, and you're altogether over it by the time it ends. You can imagine how that would feel in a classroom setting. To give your story the best chance, write it down, read it aloud, and reflect on it by either recording yourself or simply taking a different perspective, such as the listener, to see how it might translate to a learning environment. If you're thinking that this seems like all too much work for one story, consider this. Firstly, you can reuse your story for every new class you conduct. Secondly, you can make minor changes to a good story to highlight different key points. And lastly, doing the work now will make it easier for you over time as you discover the power of storytelling and learn to refine your own process. The end or conclusion of a story intended for learning must contain these three things. 1. A moral, a reason that justifies the choices made during the story or a fact that identifies the right from the wrong. 2. Key learning points. At least one, maybe several, learning points can be derived from one situation. These can be explicit, in other words, stated obviously, or implicit, where the meanings need to be considered by your listener before coming to a conclusion. And 3, the definitive end. In this case, I like to end with a question to the learners, usually an open question to start a discussion or a reflection on what they've learned. Don't just finish the story by staring out to your learners with anticipation. So that's it. Why stories are so important for learning and how to create your own stories that have a lasting impact on your students. Good luck, and please leave a comment if you've had experiences around the topic of storytelling. See you soon.